Greetings, ladies and gents, and welcome to this latest version of Tales from Outer Space, where I take an HFY story from somewhere around the internet and read it aloud for your enjoyment. All the relevant links are down below. Like, subscribe, and all that YouTube comf to help this video and channel grow. Anyways, as always, I hope that you enjoy. I would just like to thank the following Tier 5 patrons and channel members for supporting the channel: BuzzKillington, Datamagnet, and Bob the Dragon. Thank you again. And now, on to the story. Pretty Little Deathworlders, the Bringer of War. Written by Gifted Earth. The craft left dark space just beyond the Orc cloud, at the very edge of the Sol system. Gas and dust rippled in a wake. Nearby sensors blared their warnings, then were silenced. Sol itself had nothing but a slightly brighter point of light in the distance. She approached cautiously. Her pilots were wary of traps and tricks. Her lost's history made it clear that any alien species faced with imminent extinction will fight back with incandescent fury, regardless of how generally aggressive they were normally. It was only natural. Humanity would be slightly different, in that they would undoubtedly be even more vicious in their defense of their species. They could have prepared absolutely anything, would have prepared absolutely anything. And yet, things were quiet. Mining drones buzzed past as the craft drifted past the dwarf planet that they were mining. Stations orbiting the local gas giants were abandoned and silent. The craft paused by the Saturn to make sure that there was nothing unpleasant hiding in those spectacular rings. Marani took personal note of this alien world's beauty. How lovely for humanity to be born in such a system. Perhaps when the lost future had been secured, they could settle in Sol. That would be nice. It wasn't until the craft's spiraling journey took her by Jupiter that anything actually happened. Her sensors suddenly began to shriek proximity warnings as a huge human ship uncloaked and sailed out of Jupiter's upper atmosphere. She was a sleek beast, similar to a killer whale, but much, much larger. Her name was the UHN Roosevelt, was emblazoned on her sides in every alphabet used by humanity. Roosevelt did not immediately strike. Neither did her swarming entourage of ships from every civilization in the Stellar League. Instead, she opened the Battle of Sol with a broadcast. The same alien face appeared on every screen on every lost ship. It was the face of a human with a dark mane and black eyes. Marani immediately recognized the human ambassador, Mickey Yamada, the one who chased down her lobotomized assassin. Marani felt a little respect for this alien. Just a little. Of course, she immediately ordered her technicians to shut down the broadcast. As they scrambled to obey, Mickey Yamada began to speak. "This is a message to the lost," she began. "I am Mickey Yamada, the official ambassador of the human race to the stars. I speak on behalf of my people and give yours an offer. We have heard your story of betrayal and world killers. We are sorry to hear that. The death of your home world was an atrocity by the standards of any civilized species. But I'm not just contacting you to offer my condolences. I'm contacting you to offer you a deal. If you cease your attack, if you choose not to burn our worlds and eradicate our species, we will spare you. We do not want to wipe your people from the universe. There has been enough of that already. We would rather talk than fight. However, if you should fire your craft's main weapon on any of the 3 worlds, there will be a reckoning." Her voice turned harsh and furious. "We will give you a chance, but we are not fools." She paused to collect herself, and then spoke again. "I now speak directly with War Queen Paya Marani." The monarch in question froze. We have gathered that you are a wise, well-respected leader who cares deeply for his subjects. If this is true, then please end this now. We will kill you all if necessary, but we don't want to. There is another way. You have the power to..." The message cut out, and Marani composed herself. A few of her crew looked at her nervously, awaiting her response. She snarled, "A pack of lies! They must think that we're all stupid as that technician. Kill them all!" The order was swiftly relayed. Ships poured out of the craft, weapons primed and ready to fire on anything that got within range. Aboard the UNS Roosevelt, at least one person shook their head and muttered, "We fricking warned them." The crew of the craft watched in horror as the asteroid belt began to move. Of course, the asteroids themselves weren't moving. That would be silly. The ships concealed alongside them were. It was almost as if the entire navy of the Stellar League had been parked between Mars and Jupiter. Even more shockingly, half of the ships were of human design. And even more shockingly, what the hell are those? Those aren't spaceships. They look like No, they're actual ships. They're fucking boats. "Don't believe it," said Pack Admiral Kufkri. "They stuck stellar engines and shielding onto normal ships." "That's one way to upsize your defenses," her first mate commented dryly. 1,000,000 miles away in her command center, Baya Marani laughed in dumbfounded disbelief. This was certainly a new tactic. "There's no chance that there's anyone on those things, is there?" Kufkri asked his chief communications technician. "Not a chance, sir. I can see from even this basic readings that they're not airtight." "Bizarre." Kufkri's 4 eyes narrowed as he watched the readings. Then they widened with realization. "Oh, crap! Get our forces away from those things!" But it was too late. Ship after ship accelerated into the thick of the fighting, then blew their engines in dramatic fireballs. Many were nuclear, many were conventional. The entire Cold War had been packed onto every military navy on Earth and fired into the battle, piloted from the relative safety of Mars. The last forces swerved to avoid the bizarre onslaught. Radiation poured from the obliterated hulls of the ships, creating pockets where the intership communications became garbled and messy. It was a clever tactic, which was why the League had borrowed it from the last. The last rallied around the craft, preparing to defend her as she made her inevitable approach through the Hawking Strait and towards Mars, Earth, and Luna. Swift, powerful fighters darted out ahead, directly engaging in the League's forces. 1,000 firefights broke out across the Sol system. The large ships were more cautious now. They had learnt the hard way that the Night Witchers were not to be ignored. Kali and her sisters had picked up new friends from across the League once it was clear that their daring tactics were effective. Every destroyer and battleship had a strike drone hovering around their aft ends, daring the Witches to attack. And attack they did. Stealth is far easier in one's home turf, especially when you have 4 gas giants and an entire asteroid belt to hide in, as well as an entire harnessed energy of a Dyson swarm to power your attacks. The Witches came from every angle they could, many burnt in their attempts. Not every attempt was successful. Slowly but surely, the Witches whittled away at their enemies. Marani watched the conflict unfold from a command center. Some lost learned to make their 4 eyes look in 4 different directions at once, which was disorienting, but also quite useful once you got used to it. Marani was one of these lost. Each of her eyes focused on a different part of the system, monitoring everything that she physically could. Her lips curled back into a silent snarl. Something wasn't right, but she couldn't put a claw on what precisely that was. Yes, this was a violent conflict that would surely claim tens of thousands of lives even before the craft fired on any inhabited bodies. But it wasn't violent enough. Surely the humans had access to all kinds of powerful weaponry. Why weren't they using it? Why was this playing out like every other battle between the Lost and the League? The only way to save the worlds was to destroy the craft. They knew this. So why was nobody attacking the craft directly? Why weren't they even trying to do so? They hadn't even tried to get one of the nuclear boats to hit the craft, which wouldn't have disabled her, of course, but it would definitely have been an issue. War Queen! The shout from the communications technician broke through Mirani's thoughts. We're receiving another broadcast from the League. What? Didn't they block that already? The technician looked very uncomfortable. It's not just a generic broadcast on all bands like the last one. It's actually using our communication network to broadcast. As if on cue, the message began to play. This time, they saw not Mickey Yamada, but Zuzina of the Doozy. Reading the plant's expression was basically impossible for Mirani, but the words were clear. This is a message to the lost, Zuzina began. You have committed atrocities against the League, and most especially against my people, the Doozy. We are not a warlike people. We are the opposite, in fact. And yet, here we are. Do you know of the pain that you have caused, the wilting and the wailing of the survivors of your attacks? The view changed to a series of recordings of refugees aboard the fleeing ships. Most were Doozy, but not all. Even if Mirani couldn't read their expressions, she could see the desperation and sadness in their postures. In many shots, the refugees were leaning on each other for support. To Mirani's surprise, they didn't even lean on their own kind. A huge, hulking Vector cradled two Doozy in its arms, heedless of the inherent danger of such an action. A concerned Sensetti perched on a shaking, injured form of a Lakalan. A human medic tended an elder Bema. Propaganda, Mirani said without thinking. The image on the screen returned to Zuzina. We have suffered. We want that suffering to stop, but we don't want you to experience what we have. You may be acting like monsters, but you are people. We are willing to fight to defend ourselves and our friends in the stars if we absolutely have to. But we don't want to. We're all civilized, sapient. The broadcast cut off just as the one before it had. Mirani's blood began to boil. How are they using the sealed communication network? Well, the only way it could do is if they had a broadcaster that was linked to the network. For instance, the one that was part of the insert name here. But how would they have gotten access codes? It was a rhetorical question. Everyone in the room knew that there was only one way the League could have obtained the access codes necessary to activate the broadcaster and get into the Lost's network. They would have had to be told those codes. The silence was deafening. I thought so. Pack Commander Carl is apparently just compromised as a worthless, cowardly traitor of a technician. Kill her before she can do any more damage. If any of her pack try to stop her execution, kill them too. And, for the love of fuck, if that spineless spawn of a broken vat shows his head for even a second, blast it to pieces. In a very cramped corner of a disused maintenance tunnel, the technician in question was listening to the command room with a hastily made audio receiver that he'd plugged into the barely working COM port. Oh. Hermes suddenly set the receiver down and started to move. The battle raged on. The League's defenses had formed into bulky lines of warships along the path of the craft. They now followed a predictable pattern. Each front would take out as many of the craft's entourage as they could, and then fall back to the next front when the craft itself got too close. The waves of defenders got bulkier every time. None could touch the craft. Strangely, none even tried. Do they believe her to be indestructible? Mirani wondered as she settled back into a command chair. Why wouldn't they even try? Even more strangely was how they picked off the ships that they did bother attacking. They fired almost exclusively at the engines. Yes, that was the most reasonable tactic, but any ship designer with half a neuron would see the coming and reinforce the living data outside of the engines. There were much simpler ways to take out a ship, so why go for the engines? They have a plan. I just can't work out what it is. Perhaps the plan is to die. There were more broadcasts, or rather, there were more attempts at broadcasts. Pack Commander Cal's access codes were revoked almost immediately, preventing any more members of the League from spouting their propaganda at the last. Veiled propaganda was never going to be enough to stop the craft. She slowly approached the last major line of the League's defenses, right in the midpoint of the Hawking Strait. Asteroids rippled in the craft's wake. Her enormous gravitational field vastly outweighed anything else in the area. The defenders held firm. UHN Roosevelt and her allies waited for their foes to enter firing range. A field of mines lay in front of them, daring the craft's smaller ships to approach. There was, for a moment, a lull in the chaos of the battle, as the two sides sized each other up. Then chaos erupted once more. It was a firefight like none other. Fighters broke rank and charged at each other, firing wildly. Some struck the mines, others were torn apart by their foes' weapons, yet others had their engines exploded by a lucky shot. They were followed by larger craft, less concerned by the mines and more by the lurking threat of the Night Witches. Carly and her sisters weaved in and out, dodging shots and desperately trying to shut down as many of the last ships as they could. Here, the League could be on the attack. The last fighters pulled back in parts to defend their mothership, letting the League's own ships push forward into the last lines. It was at this moment that the Unchained bombers made their appearance. They screamed into the front lines and overloaded their ships into nuclear firework displays. Communications began to break down, and the League pulled back. The craft moved forward. Admiral Masova watched the chaos with her heart in her throat. Queen Admiral, she, of righteous fervor, had decided to join her on the bridge of the Roosevelt in a show of solidarity. The giant bug looked as tense as Masova felt. At least, the nervous clicking wasn't as annoying as it had been to begin with. Is it time, do you think? The Queen Admiral's voice was somehow both booming and soothing. Masova nodded. Pull back, she said. That's an order. We disengage now. Everyone get into the asteroid field. Now! The last watched in befuddlement as the League's forces suddenly crumbled and vanished, their ships streaking out into the strait and into the relative noise of the asteroid field. Some went backwards into the inner circle of the system. Most of these were the human-designed ships, Marani noticed. They're abandoning the humans, one Pack Admiral crowed from his position on the deck of the battleship. It's happening just as you predicted, War Queen. The Alliance had fallen apart, apparently. Something nagged at Marani's instincts. She hadn't gotten this far without being able to notice when something was wrong. But whatever was going on, they now had a smooth path to Mars. The formerly red planet was starting to come into view. Don't let your guards down, she warned. Advance, but keep an eye on the asteroid belt. Something here stinks like a target cub. The craft advanced, slowing as she came closer and closer to her first target of the battle. Mars. It was little small for an inhabited world, but not massively so. Its domed cities glittered in the light of the distant star that gave it warmth. Greenery was beginning to flourish outside of these sealed areas, but terraforming was one hell of a task, so most buildings were still within the safety of the climate-controlled domes. There were 2 moons, so tiny that they barely even counted. The craft's gravity began to war with Mars for mastery of the 2 rocks. Phobos and Deimos drifted towards the intruder as the laws of physics dictated they would, their ancient orbits disrupted by this event. The human forces still nipped at the craft's entourage, blasting apart any ship they could. A few even broke rank and tried to attack the visible structures on the craft's outer hull. They didn't do any damage, but it was the thought that counted. "Prepare to fire!" With those words, Marani signed the death warrants of each and every person on the planet Mars. The craft's vast front plating shifted apart, revealing the building inferno within. The moon-sized dark engine was now visible, its energy output being rapidly converted into a devastating weapon. Those on the right side of Mars to see her huddled together and prayed to whatever gods they believed in. Those on the other side did the same, but without the visual aid. Out of the corner of one of her eyes, Marani noticed something. The two wayward moons were speeding up. Wow, that wasn't too odd. She wasn't an expert in how gravity worked, or how much small bodies might be affected by the charging of the dark gun. It bothered her all the same. The uneasy feeling that had been bubbling within her this entire battle was starting to boil over. She turned to her physics advisor. "Advisor Talga," she said in a level voice, "am I being paranoid, or is there something wrong with those two moons?" Talga swapped her attention from the gun to the moons. She watched as they accelerated towards the craft. "You're not being paranoid at all, my war queen. That does not look right." She pulled out a notebook and did a couple quick calculations. "They are moving far too fast, and at an angle that isn't right for their gravitational pull. It's almost like, someone put engines on them?" She trailed off. Phobos and Deimos hurtled towards the craft at speeds they would otherwise never achieve. They moved in ways that a simple rock never could, dodging the attempts of the last fighters to stop their advance. Then they threw themselves down the main gun of the craft, their angles perfectly calculated. Deimos was slightly off and simply fell into the engine. Phobos struck true. The huge influx of matter at just the right speed, angle, and timing made the dark engine sputter, flare, and then vanish from its plane of existence. The World Killers hadn't been stupid enough to only have one functioning engine, of course. The auxiliary engines of the craft went from their normal low-level operation to a level of full output, keeping the life support and other vital systems of the craft alive. But with the main engine core gone, the craft could not fire. Marani's jaw dropped as she processed the situation. "They threw their moons at us!" End of chapter. And that, my friends, concludes this video. I hope that you enjoyed, and if you do, please consider supporting the author, even by popping over and leaving a thumbs up or a nice comment, just to show your appreciation for the story. However, if you wish to support this channel, there are links down below which will help immensely. I will see you all in the next one, and until then, I hope that you have a fantastic day. Cheers.